It is the single most audacious claim in human history. A first-century Jewish preacher from an obscure corner of the Roman Empire is brutally executed by the most efficient killing machine the world had ever known. He's buried in a borrowed tomb. 3 days later, his followers claim he walked out, alive, not just resuscitated, but resurrected, transformed, appearing to hundreds of people before ascending into heaven. This is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is not a footnote to the Christian story. It is the entire foundation, as the Apostle Paul himself wrote with brutal honesty in 1 Korinthians. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Everything hangs on this one, seemingly impossible event. If it happened, it validates Jesus' claims, changes everything about reality, and offers hope beyond the grave. If it didn't happen, then Christianity, as Paul admits, is based on a tragic delusion, a lie, or a myth. But can history even touch such a claim? Isn't a miracle, by definition, outside the bounds of historical investigation, which deals with natural causes and effects? Many skeptics would say yes. The resurrection is a matter of faith, not fact. End of story. But what if we could approach this not just as theologians, but as historians? What if we could apply the standard tools of historical analysis to the evidence we do possess? What if we could establish certain core facts about the events surrounding Jesus' death that are agreed upon by the vast majority of historians, including critical, skeptical, and non-Christian scholars? And what if we could then ask, what explanation best accounts for these agreed-upon facts? Today, we are putting the resurrection to the historical test. We will examine the minimal facts accepted by critical scholarship and weigh the competing explanations. Was the resurrection a real, space-time event? Or is it the greatest myth ever told? Let's be upfront about the challenge. History, as a discipline, typically operates within a framework of methodological naturalism. This means historians look for natural explanations for events. They work with probabilities based on common human experience. Miracles, supernatural interventions fall outside this normal framework. A historian generally cannot prove a miracle occurred in the way they might prove Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So, does this mean history must be automatically silent about the resurrection? Not necessarily. While history might not be able to prove a supernatural event directly, it can investigate the evidence surrounding a claimed event. It can establish certain facts about what happened after Jesus' death, and it can evaluate various natural explanations proposed to account for those facts. If all plausible natural explanations fail to adequately account for the established historical data, then the historian is faced with a choice. They can either say, "We simply don't know what happened," or they can consider whether the explanation offered by the primary sources themselves, even if it involves a miracle, might, in fact, be the most historically coherent explanation for the effects observed. This approach often utilizes what's known as the minimal facts argument, popularized by scholars like Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. It focuses only on those specific historical data points surrounding Jesus' fate that are so strongly attested by the evidence that they are granted by nearly all scholars who study the subject, regardless of their religious beliefs. What are these minimal facts? Based on decades of historical Jesus scholarship, a broad consensus, though not unanimous on every detail, has emerged around several key points. Fact number 1. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. This is perhaps the most secure fact about Jesus. It's attested in all four Gospels, by the Apostle Paul, and by non-Christian sources like the Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus. Crucifixion was a brutal Roman method of execution. Victims did not survive. The idea that Jesus merely swooned or fainted on the cross is rejected by virtually all relevant historians. Fact number 2. Jesus' disciples sincerely believed that he appeared to them after his death. This is also almost universally accepted. Something dramatic happened that transformed Jesus' followers. They went from being terrified, scattered, and demoralized after his execution. Mark 14:50 shows them fleeing to being bold proclaimers that he was alive. We know they believed this because, their transformation, their radical change in behavior is undeniable. They suddenly faced persecution, imprisonment, and eventual martyrdom, all based on their unwavering testimony that they had seen the risen Jesus. People might die for a belief they think is true, but it's psychologically implausible for so many to willingly suffer and die for something they knew they had fabricated, like a stolen body. Early testimony. Their belief is attested extremely early. The Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians around 55 AD, just 25 years after the crucifixion, quotes an even earlier creedal formula that he says he received, likely dating back to within a few years of Jesus' death. This creed lists specific witnesses to the resurrection appearances: Peter, Cephas, the 12, more than 500 brothers at one time, James, and finally Paul himself. This isn't a legend developing decades later. This is an immediate explosion of belief based on claimed eyewitness experiences. Fact number 3. The conversion of James, Jesus' brother. During Jesus' lifetime, his own brothers were skeptical, even hostile, to his claims. Mark 3:21, John 7-5. Yet, shortly after Jesus' death, his brother James emerges as the leader of the Jerusalem church. What caused this dramatic change? The early creed Paul quotes lists a specific appearance to James. The most plausible explanation for James's conversion is that he, too, believed he had encountered the risen Christ. Fact number 4. The conversion of Paul, Saul of Tarsus. This is perhaps the most powerful single piece of evidence. Paul was not a grieving disciple looking for hope. He was Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee, a zealous persecutor of the early Christian movement. He actively hunted down believers. Then, suddenly, on the road to Damascus, he has an experience that radically transforms him into the greatest apostle of the very movement he was trying to destroy. Paul consistently attributed this conversion to a direct, personal encounter with the risen Jesus, Acts 9, Galatians 1. His conversion is incredibly difficult to explain away naturalistically. These 4 facts: Jesus' death, the disciples' sincere belief in his appearances, James's conversion, and Paul's conversion are granted by the vast majority of critical historians. A 5th fact: the empty tomb is accepted by a significant majority, perhaps 75% of relevant scholars, but is slightly more debated. So we'll treat it as strong supporting evidence rather than a minimal fact for now. The historical question then becomes, what scenario best explains all of these agreed upon facts? Skeptics have, quite reasonably, proposed various naturalistic explanations over the centuries to account for the rise of the resurrection belief without resorting to a miracle. Let's examine the most common ones in light of the minimal facts. 1. The legend-myth theory. This was popular in the 19th century. It suggests the resurrection story wasn't an intentional deception. but grew gradually over time, like myths about heroes, embellished by later generations. Asterisk problem. This theory has largely collapsed under the weight of the early dating. As mentioned, the core belief in the resurrection appearances is attested in Paul's letters and the pre-Pauline Creed in 1 Corinthians, Kingsley placing it firmly within the first few years, possibly even months after Jesus' death. This is simply not enough time for a significant legend to develop and solidify in a way that convinces eyewitnesses who were still alive, Paul notes, to die for it. Legends typically take generations, not months, to obscure historical facts. 2. The wrong tomb theory. Perhaps the women and disciples simply went to the wrong tomb on Sunday morning, found it empty, and mistakenly assumed a resurrection. Asterisk problem. This struggles to explain several factors. The Gospels depict the tomb's location as known Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. It doesn't explain the subsequent appearances of Jesus. Most importantly, the Jewish and Roman authorities, who had every motive to crush this new movement, could have easily stopped it by simply going to the correct tomb and producing Jesus' body. The fact that they never did, and instead accused the disciples of stealing the body, Matthew 28 to 11:15, strongly suggests the tomb was empty. 3. The swoon theory. Perhaps Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He merely fainted or swooned from exhaustion and blood loss, was mistaken for dead, revived in the coolness of the tomb, somehow rolled away the massive stone, evaded the guards, if present, and then appeared to his disciples, convincing them he had conquered death. Asterisk problem. This theory, popular in the 18th century but now almost universally rejected by scholars, fails on multiple fronts. Roman soldiers were professional executioners. They knew how to ensure death, often breaking legs to hasten suffocation. John's Gospel specifically mentions Jesus being pierced in the side with a spear, resulting in a flow of blood and water, often interpreted as indicating death had already occurred, cardiac rupture, pleural effusion. Even if Jesus had somehow survived, he would have been a horrific, mutilated, barely alive figure emerging from the tomb needing medical attention. Not someone who could inspire worship and convince his followers he was the glorified Lord of life who had defeated death itself. 4. The hallucination theory. Could the appearances simply have been hallucinations? Visions brought on by the disciples' intense grief, expectation, and psychological distress. Asterisk problem. This is perhaps the most popular modern naturalistic explanation, but it faces significant hurdles when trying to account for all the facts. Nature of hallucinations. Hallucinations are typically private, individual events, rooted in the subject's own mind. The resurrection appearances are reported as happening to groups, the 12, the 500 plus, simultaneously and consistently across different times and places. Mass, shared hallucinations of this specific nature are virtually unknown in psychological literature. Asterisk, variety of witnesses. The appearances weren't just to grieving followers who might be psychologically primed for wishful thinking. They were reported to skeptics like James and outright enemies like Paul. What explains their transformative experiences, which went directly against their prior beliefs and expectations? Asterisk physical nature. The Gospels describe the appearances as involving physical interactions, eating fish, being touched, showing wounds, Luke 24, John 20. While these details might be theological embellishments, the core belief transmitted from the beginning seems to have been in a bodily resurrection, not just a subjective vision or ghost sighting. Hallucinations don't typically eat breakfast. Empty tomb. If the appearances were just hallucinations, what happened to Jesus' body? A hallucination theory requires a separate explanation for the empty tomb, like the disciples stealing it, which has its own problems. 5. The conspiracy theory disciples stole the body. Perhaps the disciples, in a desperate attempt to keep the movement alive, stole Jesus' body from the tomb and then fabricated the story of his resurrection. Problem. This theory runs headlong into minimal fact number 2. The disciples' sincere belief and their radical transformation. It requires us to believe that these men, who had been cowardly and scattered, suddenly became the most brilliant conspirators in history, concocting a lie so convincing that they were willing to endure persecution, imprisonment, torture, and brutal martyrdoms for something they knew was a fraud. What was their motive? They gained no wealth, power, or worldly status, only suffering. The conspiracy theory struggles mightily to explain the psychological transformation and unwavering commitment of the earliest witnesses. So, if the major naturalistic explanations each face significant historical and psychological difficulties in accounting for all the minimal facts, where does that leave us? The Christian apologist argues that we are left with the explanation offered by the disciples themselves. Jesus physically rose from the dead. The argument is not that history can prove a miracle occurred through its normal methods. Rather, it's an inference to the best explanation. The claim is that the resurrection hypothesis, while involving a supernatural event, provides a more coherent, comprehensive, and adequate explanation for the entire constellation of agreed-upon historical facts than any of the proposed naturalistic alternatives combined. The resurrection hypothesis explains the empty tomb, if accepted. Jesus was raised, therefore the tomb was empty. The appearances, Jesus physically appeared to his followers. The disciples' belief and transformation. They sincerely believed because they actually saw the risen Christ, which transformed them from cowards into martyrs. James's conversion. The skeptical brother encountered the risen Lord and believed. Paul's conversion. The enemy encountered the risen Lord and was radically changed. While invoking a miracle might seem like an extraordinary step, proponents argue that the evidence itself is extraordinary and demands an extraordinary explanation. The unique combination of the empty tomb, the multiple, varied appearances to individuals and groups, including skeptics and enemies, and the immediate explosive birth of the Christian movement requires a cause sufficient for the effect. The resurrection, they argue, provides that sufficient cause in a way that hallucinations, legends, or conspiracies simply cannot. We stand at a crossroads. We have a set of core historical facts surrounding the death of Jesus, facts granted by a wide consensus of scholars across the ideological spectrum. We have several naturalistic theories proposed to explain these facts, each facing significant challenges. And we have the explanation offered by the earliest witnesses themselves. A literal, bodily resurrection. This brings us to the ultimate debate, the point where historical analysis meets philosophical worldview. Does the failure of naturalistic explanations to adequately account for the minimal facts, combined with the explanatory power of the resurrection hypothesis itself, make the resurrection the most reasonable historical inference, even though it requires accepting a unique, supernatural event? Should the evidence lead us to question our naturalistic assumptions, or does the inherent improbability of a miracle, the fact that resurrections simply don't happen in our common experience, mean that any naturalistic explanation, however flawed or incomplete, must a priori be considered more likely than a supernatural one? Should our prior assumptions about what is possible dictate our conclusion, regardless of where the specific historical evidence seems to point? This is not just a question about an ancient event. It's a question about how we weigh evidence, how we assess probability, and what we believe is ultimately possible. Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. Does the historical evidence for the resurrection persuade you, or do the challenges remain too great? Where do you think the balance of evidence lies? If you found this deep dive into perhaps the most critical historical question for Western civilization engaging, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that rigorously explores the intersection of faith, history, and reason. Thanks for watching.